In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where power crystallizes into its most naked form, Niccolò Machiavelli spent countless hours observing the theater of human ambition. What he witnessed there, and what he distilled into his most controversial writings, represents perhaps the most unflinching examination of human nature ever committed to parchment. His observations cut through the comfortable illusions that societies construct about themselves, revealing the raw mechanics of how people truly behave when the stakes matter most. The wisdom that emerges from Machiavelli's work is not the kind that inspires or uplifts. Instead, it serves as a cold mirror held up to humanity's face, reflecting back truths so uncomfortable that centuries of scholars have tried to soften their edges or explain them away. Yet these insights remain as relevant today as they were in Renaissance Italy, because the fundamental patterns of human behavior, our capacity for self-deception, our predictable responses to fear and desire, our tendency to mistake our own interests for universal principles, remain unchanged despite all our technological and social evolution. The first pillar of Machiavellian insight rests on a foundation that most find deeply disturbing: the recognition that human beings are fundamentally unreliable narrators of their own motivations. People rarely do what they claim they will do, and, even more rarely, for the reasons they publicly state. This is not necessarily because they are consciously lying, though that certainly occurs, but because the human mind possesses an almost supernatural ability to rationalize whatever serves its immediate interests while maintaining the fiction that it is acting from noble principle. Consider how Machiavelli observed the behavior of princes and citizens alike when faced with threats to their security or prosperity. Invariably, he noted, people who had sworn eternal loyalty would switch sides the moment it became advantageous to do so. Treaties signed with great ceremony would be broken without hesitation when circumstances changed. Leaders who proclaimed their devotion to justice would implement the most brutal policies when their power was threatened. Yet in each case, the actors involved would find elaborate justifications for their behavior, convincing themselves and attempting to convince others that their actions were not only necessary but morally correct. This pattern extends far beyond the realm of politics into every aspect of human social organization. Religious communities that preach love and tolerance demonstrate remarkable capacity for hatred when their doctrines are challenged. Business leaders who speak eloquently about fair competition engage in practices designed to eliminate their rivals by any means necessary. Citizens who demand government accountability become remarkably flexible about ethical standards when their own interests are at stake. Machiavelli understood that this inconsistency is not a bug in human nature but a feature. The ability to simultaneously hold contradictory beliefs and to adjust one's principles based on immediate circumstances represents a form of mental flexibility that has evolutionary advantages. It allows individuals to adapt quickly to changing situations without the paralysis that might result from rigid adherence to abstract principles. However, this same flexibility makes human beings deeply unreliable as partners, allies, or even friends when serious pressures are applied. The implications of this insight are profound and disturbing. It suggests that most human relationships are fundamentally conditional, held together not by genuine affection or shared values but by the continuing alignment of interests. When those interests diverge significantly, the relationships dissolve with a speed that often shocks those who believed in their permanence. Machiavelli witnessed this pattern repeatedly in the political realm, where alliances that had seemed unbreakable crumbled overnight when the balance of power shifted. More troubling still is the recognition that this tendency toward strategic flexibility is not limited to obviously self-interested behavior. People demonstrate the same capacity for rapid ethical adjustment when acting in groups, convinced that their collective action is inherently more legitimate than individual self-seeking. The mob that lynches an innocent person is composed of individuals who would never consider themselves capable of murder. The bureaucracy that implements genocidal policies consists largely of people who think of themselves as decent human beings following proper procedures. The capacity for collective self-deception amplifies individual moral flexibility into something far more dangerous. Machiavelli's second great insight concerns the relationship between fear and human behavior. He observed that while people may occasionally be motivated by love, admiration, or genuine principle, fear is the most reliable and predictable motivator of human action. This is not the paralyzing fear that prevents action entirely, but the calculated fear that shapes decision-making processes in ways that are both subtle and profound. The fear that most powerfully influences human behavior is not fear of death or physical harm, though these certainly matter, but fear of losing status, security, or the respect of one's peers. Machiavelli noted that people would often accept considerable physical risk to avoid social humiliation or economic devastation. Warriors would charge into battle not primarily from courage or patriotism but from fear of being seen as cowards. Merchants would engage in dangerous ventures not from greed alone but from fear of falling behind their competitors. This insight reveals why appeals to higher principles are so often ineffective in motivating human action. When Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, he was not advocating cruelty for its own sake but recognizing a fundamental truth about human psychology: people's behavior is more reliably shaped by their assessment of consequences than by their emotional attachments or moral convictions. The practical applications of this understanding are both numerous and morally ambiguous. Leaders who understand the primacy of fear as a motivator can shape behavior much more effectively than those who rely on inspiration or moral suasion. However, the use of this knowledge inevitably corrupts the relationship between leader and follower, transforming what might have been genuine loyalty into calculated compliance. Perhaps more importantly, the recognition that fear drives human behavior helps explain why so many social and political systems that appear irrational from the outside actually function quite effectively. Legal systems work not primarily because citizens have internalized respect for law but because they fear the consequences of being caught breaking it. Economic systems function not because participants share common values about fairness but because they fear the results of not participating. Even social norms are maintained largely through fear of exclusion or disapproval rather than through genuine consensus about their value. This creates a paradox that Machiavelli found endlessly fascinating: the systems that provide human beings with the greatest security and prosperity are often built on foundations of mutual mistrust and carefully calibrated fear. Democratic governments maintain their legitimacy not through the genuine consent of the governed but through the widespread fear of what might happen if existing institutions collapsed. Market economies create wealth not through cooperation and goodwill but through the fear each participant has of being outcompeted by others. The recognition that fear is the primary motivator of human behavior also explains why idealistic reform movements so often fail to achieve their stated objectives. Reformers typically assume that people will change their behavior once they understand the moral or practical superiority of the proposed changes. However, if existing patterns of behavior are maintained primarily by fear rather than ignorance, providing better information or stronger moral arguments will have little effect. Change occurs only when the feared consequences of maintaining the status quo exceed the feared consequences of accepting the proposed changes. This dynamic helps explain why meaningful social change often requires either the application of external pressure, through law, economic incentives, or social pressure, or the occurrence of crises that make existing arrangements untenable. The civil rights movement in America succeeded not primarily because it convinced white Americans of the moral superiority of racial equality but because it made the continuation of legal segregation more costly and dangerous than its abolition. Environmental regulations are implemented not because people become convinced of their moral duty to protect nature but because they come to fear the consequences of environmental degradation more than the costs of changing their behavior. Machiavelli's third and, perhaps most devastating insight concerns the relationship between intelligence and wisdom in human affairs. He observed that being highly intelligent in the conventional sense, possessing analytical ability, factual knowledge, and logical reasoning skills, provides no protection against making catastrophically stupid decisions when emotions, group dynamics, or self-interest are involved. This observation challenges one of the fundamental assumptions of rational discourse, the idea that smart people, given accurate information and sufficient time to consider their options, will generally make sound decisions. Machiavelli's experience in government and diplomacy taught him that the opposite is often true. Highly educated, intellectually sophisticated individuals frequently make choices that are obviously self-destructive to outside observers, not because they lack the ability to see the likely consequences but because other factors override their analytical capabilities. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is both simple and profound. Intelligence operates most effectively when applied to problems that are emotionally neutral and involve clear criteria for success. However, most important human decisions involve multiple, often conflicting objectives and trigger strong emotional responses that interfere with rational analysis. A person may be perfectly capable of solving complex mathematical problems or analyzing intricate philosophical arguments while simultaneously making disastrous choices about their career, relationships, or financial investments. More troubling still is the way that intelligence can actually compound poor decision-making by providing more sophisticated justifications for choices that serve emotional needs rather than rational objectives. Highly intelligent people are often better at constructing elaborate rationalizations for their decisions than less intelligent people, which can make them more committed to courses of action that are obviously flawed to outside observers. The intellectual capacity that should serve as protection against bad decisions instead becomes a tool for defending them. This pattern is particularly pronounced in academic, political, and professional environments where intelligence is highly valued and where admitting error carries significant social costs. Machiavelli observed numerous cases where learned advisors continued to advocate for policies that were clearly failing because acknowledging their mistakes would undermine their reputations for wisdom. The same intellectual pride that motivated them to develop sophisticated analyses of complex problems prevented them from recognizing when those analyses were wrong. The collective version of this phenomenon is even more dangerous. When groups of intelligent people come together to solve problems, they often engage in what might be called collaborative stupidity, the process by which individual analytical capabilities are neutralized by group dynamics that prioritize consensus and status preservation over accuracy. Committees of experts regularly produce recommendations that none of the individual members would endorse in private, because the social pressures involved in group decision-making overwhelm individual judgment. Historical examples of this pattern are abundant and sobering. The brightest military minds of Europe spent years developing strategies for World War I that maximized casualties while minimizing strategic gains. The most sophisticated economists of the 1920s created financial instruments and policies that contributed directly to the Great Depression. The most advanced political theorists of the 20th century designed governmental systems that produced some of the most brutal and ineffective regimes in human history. In each case, the problem was not lack of intelligence or information but the way that social and emotional factors interfered with the application of analytical capabilities. The same cognitive abilities that allow human beings to solve complex problems also make them vulnerable to sophisticated forms of self-deception when their interests, loyalties, or self-image are involved. Machiavelli recognized that this vulnerability represents one of the most fundamental challenges in human organization. Any system that relies on the assumption that intelligent people will generally make wise decisions is likely to fail catastrophically when tested by serious pressures. Effective institutions must be designed to function despite the tendency of even highly capable individuals to make poor choices when their emotions, interests, or social relationships are involved. This insight has profound implications for how we think about expertise, leadership, and decision-making in complex organizations. It suggests that the most dangerous people in positions of authority are often those who are both highly intelligent and highly confident in their analytical abilities, because they are least likely to recognize the ways that non-rational factors are influencing their judgment. Conversely, leaders who understand their own susceptibility to bias and self-deception, even if they are less intellectually sophisticated, may make better decisions because they are more likely to seek external verification of their reasoning and to build safeguards against their own limitations. The recognition that intelligence provides limited protection against stupidity also helps explain why democratic systems, despite their obvious flaws, often outperform more technocratic approaches to governance. Democratic institutions force leaders to justify their decisions to people who do not share their professional training, social background, or institutional loyalties. This external pressure, while often frustrating to experts, serves as a partial corrective to the tendency of intelligent elites to develop increasingly sophisticated justifications for increasingly poor decisions. However, Machiavelli would be quick to point out that democratic systems have their own vulnerabilities to collective stupidity. Voters frequently make choices based on emotional appeals rather than rational analysis of policy alternatives. Popular movements often embrace ideas that are obviously impractical or counterproductive. The same cognitive biases that affect individual decision-making also operate at the level of mass politics, sometimes with even more destructive consequences. The deeper lesson from Machiavelli's observations is that there is no form of human organization that is immune to the fundamental limitations of human judgment. Every system of governance, every method of collective decision-making, every approach to solving social problems must contend with the basic facts of human nature. People are unreliable narrators of their own motivations, fear is a more powerful motivator than principle, and intelligence provides limited protection against bias and self-deception. This recognition leads to what might be called Machiavellian pessimism, not the belief that human nature is inherently evil, but the understanding that it is inherently problematic in ways that cannot be solved through education, moral exhortation, or institutional reform alone. The patterns of behavior that Machiavelli identified are not aberrations that can be corrected but permanent features of the human condition that must be accepted and planned for. Yet this pessimism, paradoxically, can serve as the foundation for a more realistic and, therefore more effective approach to human organization. Systems designed with an accurate understanding of human limitations are more likely to achieve their intended objectives than systems based on optimistic assumptions about human nature. Laws that assume people will try to circumvent them are more likely to be effective than laws that assume voluntary compliance. Economic policies that account for self-interested behavior are more likely to produce desired outcomes than policies that rely on altruistic cooperation. The practical wisdom that emerges from Machiavelli's insights is not that we should abandon all attempts at moral or social improvement but that such attempts must be grounded in realistic assessments of what human beings are actually capable of achieving. This requires abandoning comfortable illusions about human nature while maintaining the discipline necessary for constructive action despite the disillusionment. The challenge of applying Machiavellian insights constructively is complicated by the fact that widespread understanding of these truths could itself be destabilizing. Social systems depend partly on shared fictions about human nature and the legitimacy of existing arrangements. If everyone understood the extent to which fear rather than principle motivates compliance with social norms, or the degree to which intelligent people are capable of sophisticated self-deception, it might become difficult to maintain the minimal levels of trust and cooperation necessary for complex societies to function. This creates what might be called the Machiavellian dilemma. The insights most necessary for effective leadership and social organization are also the insights most dangerous to share widely. Leaders who understand the reality of human nature can make more realistic decisions about policy and strategy, but they must be careful about how they communicate that understanding to others who may not be prepared for such stark honesty about human limitations. Machiavelli himself faced this dilemma in his own writing. The Prince was written as practical advice for rulers, but its insights were so disturbing to conventional moral sensibilities that it was widely condemned as immoral or atheistic. Subsequent generations of readers have struggled with the question of whether Machiavelli was describing how politics actually works or advocating for a particular approach to political leadership. The answer, from a careful reading of his complete works, seems to be both. Machiavelli believed that understanding the reality of human nature was a prerequisite for effective action in the world, but he also believed that such understanding carried moral obligations. A leader who recognizes the limitations and vulnerabilities of human beings has a responsibility to use that knowledge constructively rather than exploitatively. This raises profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. Does understanding human nature more clearly create an obligation to work for human flourishing despite that knowledge? Or does it justify a more cynical approach to human relationships based on the assumption that everyone is fundamentally motivated by self-interest? Machiavelli's own answer seems to have been that knowledge of human limitations should inspire neither cynicism nor naive optimism but a kind of tragic wisdom, the recognition that human beings are capable of both great achievements and great failures, often simultaneously, and that effective action in the world requires accepting both possibilities without being paralyzed by either. This tragic wisdom manifests itself in several practical principles that emerge from Machiavellian analysis. First, trust but verify. Assume that people mean well but create systems that function even if they do not. Second, plan for failure. Assume that any human system will eventually be corrupted, subverted, or simply break down, and build in mechanisms for correction and renewal. Third, maintain flexibility. Avoid becoming so committed to particular methods or allies that you cannot adapt when circumstances change. Fourth, understand the limits of understanding. Recognize that your own analytical capabilities are subject to the same biases and limitations that affect everyone else, and seek external checks on your reasoning. Fifth, accept responsibility without claiming certainty. Make the best decisions you can with the information available while acknowledging that you may be wrong and remaining open to correction. These principles provide a framework for action that acknowledges human limitations without succumbing to paralysis or cynicism. They suggest an approach to leadership and decision-making that is both humble about human capabilities and determined to achieve whatever improvements are actually possible within those constraints. The enduring relevance of Machiavelli's insights becomes clear when we consider contemporary examples of the patterns he identified centuries ago. Political leaders continue to make the same types of strategic errors that he witnessed in Renaissance Italy, often for exactly the same reasons: overconfidence in their analytical abilities, failure to account for the ways that fear and self-interest shaped the behavior of their allies and opponents, and susceptibility to the flattery of advisors who tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Corporate executives demonstrate the same capacity for sophisticated self-deception when making strategic decisions that serve their personal interests rather than the long-term health of their organizations. Academic institutions continue to produce elaborate justifications for policies that serve the interests of their members rather than their stated educational missions. Religious organizations continue to find theological justifications for political and economic positions that coincidentally align with the temporal interests of their leadership. The technological and social changes of the past 5 centuries have not altered these fundamental patterns of human behavior because they are rooted in cognitive and emotional structures that evolution shaped over much longer time periods. Social media may amplify the speed and reach of human self-deception, but it does not change the basic tendency to rationalize self-interested behavior as principled action. Global communications may make the consequences of poor decision-making more visible and more rapid, but they do not make intelligent people any less susceptible to bias and groupthink. If anything, modern life may make Machiavellian insights more relevant rather than less, because the complexity of contemporary social and economic systems makes the consequences of poor decision-making both more severe and more difficult to predict. The financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated how supposedly sophisticated risk management systems could be undermined by the same kinds of wishful thinking and willful blindness that Machiavelli observed in much simpler contexts. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how quickly carefully constructed social and economic arrangements could be disrupted by events that experts had long known were possible but had somehow failed to prepare for adequately. In both cases, the problems were not primarily technical but psychological. Intelligent, well-informed people made predictably poor decisions because they were influenced by factors that their analytical frameworks did not account for. Financial experts understood the mathematical principles behind risk assessment but failed to account for the ways that career incentives and social pressures would influence their application of those principles. Public health experts understood the epidemiological principles behind pandemic preparedness but failed to account for the political and economic obstacles that would interfere with implementing their recommendations. These failures illustrate a crucial point about the nature of human stupidity as Machiavelli understood it. The most dangerous forms of stupidity are not the result of ignorance or lack of analytical capability but of the systematic application of intelligence to serve emotional, social, or economic needs rather than to solve the problems they ostensibly address. An ignorant person may make mistakes, but an intelligent person in the grip of motivated reasoning can construct elaborate justifications for catastrophically poor decisions. This insight has implications that extend far beyond questions of leadership and governance into the most intimate aspects of human experience. The same cognitive patterns that make political leaders susceptible to poor strategic decisions also affect personal choices about relationships, careers, and life goals. People regularly make decisions that they know intellectually are likely to be harmful, staying in destructive relationships, pursuing careers they find meaningless, engaging in behaviors they know are self-destructive, because the emotional and social factors involved override their rational analysis. The universality of these patterns suggests that Machiavellian insights are not merely useful for understanding politics or leadership but are essential for understanding human nature itself. The capacity for self-deception, the primacy of fear as a motivator, and the limited protective value of intelligence are not features of particular types of people or particular social contexts but fundamental aspects of how human minds work under pressure. This universality also suggests that the traditional boundaries between private and public morality that many people take for granted may be largely artificial. The same psychological mechanisms that lead to corruption in government also operate in family relationships, business partnerships, and friendships. The difference is typically one of scale and consequence rather than fundamental moral character. Understanding this can be both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggests that the moral failures we observe in others are not evidence of their inherent wickedness but manifestations of psychological patterns that affect everyone under sufficient pressure. Terrifying because it suggests that our own moral integrity is more fragile and contingent than we might prefer to believe. The practical question that emerges from this understanding is not how to eliminate these vulnerabilities. Machiavelli would argue that this is impossible, but how to organize our lives and institutions in ways that minimize their harmful effects while still allowing for the creativity, flexibility, and adaptation that human communities require to flourish. This requires a delicate balance between vigilance and trust, between acknowledging human limitations and maintaining hope for human potential. Systems must be robust enough to function despite the inevitable failures of judgment and character that affect all human beings, but flexible enough to adapt and improve when better information becomes available or circumstances change. The wisdom of Machiavelli offers no easy answers to these challenges, but it does provide a framework for thinking about them more clearly. By acknowledging the reality of human nature without either condemning it as inherently evil or excusing it as merely unfortunate, we can begin to develop approaches to human organization that are both more realistic and more humane than those based on either cynical manipulation or naive optimism. The darkest aspect of Machiavellian wisdom may be its recognition that this clarity of vision often comes at a personal cost. Understanding human nature more accurately can make it more difficult to maintain the emotional connections and social commitments that give life meaning and purpose. The leader who sees too clearly how fear and self-interest motivate the behavior of allies and subordinates may find it difficult to trust anyone completely. The person who understands how easily intelligence can be co-opted by bias and self-deception may find it difficult to have confidence in their own judgment. This is perhaps why Machiavelli himself, despite the reputation for cynicism that his work has acquired, continued throughout his life to be motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of his city and his people. The recognition that human beings are flawed and unreliable did not lead him to conclude that they were unworthy of care and concern, but rather that they needed institutions and leadership that could function effectively despite those flaws. The ultimate insight that emerges from Machiavelli's analysis may be that wisdom and compassion, rather than being opposites, actually require each other. True compassion must be based on accurate understanding of human nature, including its limitations and vulnerabilities. And true wisdom must be motivated by genuine concern for human welfare, or it becomes merely a tool for manipulation and exploitation. This synthesis of realism and concern, of clear-eyed assessment and genuine care, represents perhaps the most challenging aspect of applying Machiavellian insights constructively. It requires maintaining simultaneous awareness of human failings and human potential, of the ways that people reliably disappoint expectations and the ways that they occasionally transcend them. The practical application of this understanding requires constant vigilance against both the cynicism that abandons hope for improvement and the optimism that ignores the obstacles to achieving it. It requires developing systems and relationships that can survive the inevitable betrayals, mistakes, and failures that characterize human interaction while still creating space for the cooperation, creativity, and growth that make such systems worthwhile. In our contemporary world, where the stakes of collective decision-making have never been higher and the pace of change has never been faster, these insights may be more crucial than ever. The challenges we face, from climate change to technological disruption to social inequality, require forms of cooperation and coordination that push against the natural limits of human psychology. Success will require not only technical solutions but also institutional arrangements that can function effectively despite the predictable ways that human beings will respond to pressure, uncertainty, and conflict. Machiavelli's wisdom suggests that such arrangements are possible, but only if they are designed with realistic expectations about human behavior and careful attention to the ways that individual psychology shapes collective outcomes. This requires abandoning comfortable illusions about human nature while maintaining the discipline and commitment necessary for constructive action despite that disillusionment. The merciless insights that Machiavelli offers into human stupidity are ultimately not an argument for despair but for a more sophisticated form of hope that is grounded in understanding rather than wishful thinking, and that therefore has a chance of achieving realistic improvements in human welfare despite the permanent obstacles that human nature itself creates. The legacy of Machiavellian analysis is not the cynical manipulation of human weakness for personal advantage, but the disciplined application of accurate understanding in service of human flourishing. This may be the darkest wisdom that political philosophy has to offer, but it may also be the most necessary for navigating the complexities of human organization in an uncertain world. The path forward requires neither the naive optimism that ignores human limitations nor the cynical pessimism that abandons all hope for improvement, but rather the tragic wisdom that sees clearly what human beings are capable of, both their potential for greatness and their capacity for folly, and works steadily toward whatever improvements are actually possible within those constraints.